All right, we're continuing with the imperialism unit, and this section is entitled British Imperialism in India. India was the main colony in the British Empire. The phrase they used for it was the jewel in the crown. It was their most important colony and their largest colony. If you are familiar with the Jungle Book, the reason that there's a heavy British influence is because it takes place during the time of British colonization of India. All right, how the British got there in the first place is they fought with the French over who was going to get control of India because they viewed it as so valuable. All right, the individual who was sent there by the British to lead their troops and defeat the French was this guy who's in the picture, Robert Clive. And the battle where, the culminating battle between the French and the British that resulted in the British victory was the Battle of Plassey. Right? And the way that the British made sure that this was economically valuable to them is they did not allow native Indian people to trade with anyone except for the British. So they had trade restrictions. They could only trade their products with the British. They were mass producing items that the British were responsible for in India, and they could only sell them to the British and at the price the British agreed to. Right? The British set up an independent company to facilitate the government's needs in India. So it wasn't directly run by the British government, it was a private company. And this was called the East India Company, or the British East India Company. And there's two interesting facts about this company. It's a business, it's not a government, it's not the British government, but it's interesting. So they operated like a government without a government over them. So the British government didn't directly oversee the actions of this company, but this company was acting as if it had the authority of the British government. Really unusual. And then in addition to that, this company had its own army of soldiers. Some British and some from the continent of India, which were referred to as sepoys. So you can fill that in the definition there. Sepoys are Indian soldiers in the British Army. And they accomplished their goals, the economic goals of the British government in Asia. So this is a private company that has its own army, and that's super unusual. It's not unusual to think of a government that has an army, but a company that has an army. I mean, a modern day equivalent would be like if Amazon had its own army and it went and tried to accomplish its goals in the world with the backing of an armed group of soldiers. So if you think about that for a second and how unusual that would be. Although if Amazon did have an army of soldiers, you know exactly what they would look like, right? Like 23-year-olds with man buns showing up on your front door delivering packages. I digress. That won't be on the test. Well, the East India Company set up their industries in India, and they had a variety of products that they produced, like teas and cotton, and one in particular that they were able to use in China that it gave them an advantage because the Chinese for centuries hadn't traded with anybody because nobody had anything the Chinese wanted. But the British found something in India that they could introduce to the Chinese that created a demand for it, and that was opium. And if you're not familiar, opium is a highly addictive narcotic drug. As you can see, it's smoked in these different various pictures here. And they, just like the tobacco companies today, they gave away free samples. When people tried it and got hooked on it, the British became the suppliers of it, and they found a product that Chinese people wanted that the British had, because for centuries, nobody had had anything that the Chinese would want to trade for. Essentially, Britain became, drug dealers for Chinese people that they got addicted to opium. This caused a whole conflict in China, and we'll get to that in our next unit, the next section. All right, there was also conflict in India with the British. It was awkward having Indian soldiers and British soldiers mixed together in the army, and the British demonstrated they didn't really understand the cultural differences between the people, the Indian soldiers and the British soldiers. And this diagram here illustrates an incident that happened to demonstrate that disconnect the British had with their soldiers. All right, back in the 1800s, this is the standard rifle that was issued to a British soldier. And the way that you load this, you've probably seen it in the movies before. You take the gunpowder and the bullets and you pour it into the top of the gun, and then you use the rod to jam it down so it gets all the way to the end. And then you can fire your gun, and then before you can fire again, you got to go through the whole process. So what the British did is they came up with this little carrying case, so to speak, for all those products. It was the gunpowder and the gun bullet, and they wrapped it in this paper here, and then they would take the paper and they would coat it with grease so that if it got, water wouldn't be able to break through the paper and ruin the gunpowder. Because if that happened, then you can't use it and you got to throw it away. And the way you did this is you'd tear open the end of it, you'd pour it in the gun, you'd push it down to the end, and then you could fire. And this became a problem for soldiers, for Indian soldiers in the British Army. Indian soldiers were typically one of two religions. They were either Hindu or they were Muslim. And this process created religious and cultural problems for them. It depends on what you know about Islam and Hinduism, and maybe you can figure out what the problem was. Well, the problem was, if you're a Hindu, cows are sacred. So there's no way you'd want to put cow grease into your mouth. You would never eat a cow or any part of it. And if you're a Muslim, pigs are unclean. So sometimes if they use pork grease, you'd be putting that in your mouth, and that would be a religious defilement. And you can't really tell the difference between the two. So in order to use their gun, these Indian soldiers would have to violate their religious principles in order to be able to do their basic function of their job, which is use their gun. And they felt like one of two things. Either the British didn't take the time to find out what was important for their soldiers, or they didn't care, and they were forcing the Indians to make this moral compromise. So they rebelled. And they created a rebellion referred to as the Sepoy Mutiny. They fought it. It was that issue plus a lot of other issues put together, and this was like the spark, no pun intended, that started this conflict. All right, and this was a lashing out at the British in India. All right, this would have been successful, but Muslims and Hindus, who had been fighting each other for centuries, way before British people even got there, couldn't put their differences aside and bring a united front against the British, so the British were able to divide them and defeat them. All right, and from this point on, because this was such a jarring incident, the British government took a more active role in governing India. So before they left it up to the East India Company, once the Sepoy Mutiny happened, the British government said, okay, you can't control India, so we're going to take over. And that meant more oversight, more regulation for Indian people. And that time is referred to as the British Raj. We don't have a definition for that, but Raj is an Indian word that means king. It's like the British rule over India. All right, the whole experience in India, Britain contributed some positive and negative things. So let's look at some of those. All right, so these are the negative impacts the British had on India. No, I'm sorry, positives. Oops, I mixed them up. So this should be number 10. Number 10, not number 9. Ended local warfare, created the third largest rail network, and improved Indian infrastructure. All these things were brought to India by Europeans and worked out for the betterment of Indian people. So this is number 10. And then number 9, negatives of imperialism, threatened traditional Indian life. A lot of their cultural traits were not respected and implemented and maintained by the British. They overproduced cash crops, cotton, opium, tea. Those are all things you can make money on, but you can't balance your diet with. So a lot of Indian people died. They starved to death because they weren't producing enough food. And they restricted Indian industries, like they only let them trade with Britain when they could have made a lot more money if they had traded with the entire world. So these are some positive and negative impacts of British occupation in India.